All right, welcome back, everyone. I ask everybody to take their seats. We're going to get started. We're here with Dr. Kimberly Humphrey, who is going to share with us some storytelling around fire. So, el fuego. Let me turn it over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now? How's that? Excellent. All right. So, as expressed, I'm going to be talking about fires and the health impacts of fires. And what I want you to think about whilst we're talking about this is, what is the best way for us to tell our stories? What is the most impactful way? What is the way we need to tell the stories within our own community, but also when we're thinking about using climate's impact on health as a lever for cross-sectoral action? What is the best way to communicate that? So we're going to explore a few different things and a few different ways that we can potentially look at talking about things like the health impact of fires. So next slide, please. Lovely, thank you. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore a few different things. I'm going to talk about the impact of fire on facilities, on workforce, on patients, on communities. I'm going to do a little bit of delving into academia and research, look at patient stories as well. So thinking about how all of these different areas, how can we convey, express, discuss, get our message across? So I live in Australia. Fire is a problem in Australia. Fire's always been a problem in Australia, but it's getting worse, like many things with climate change. So we know our fire seasons are getting longer, they're getting more intense, and they're occurring more frequently as well. Next slide, please. In 2019, 2020, we had catastrophic bushfires in Australia like we hadn't experienced ever before. And one of the consequences of that is things that we didn't think would burn did. So areas that we hadn't thought were fire risk had fires, had catastrophic fires. And it really caused us, as it has many people throughout the world, to rethink what climate change looks like in terms of its impacts on us and our communities, and what the future looks like, what we need to do to prepare. So impacts of bushfires on the healthcare system, I don't know why that didn't work. Quite profound. The point I wanted to make with this slide, which is missing a lot of content, hooray, is it's not just impacts on hospitals or supply chains, it's impacts on the people, it's impacts on their health. It's not just the direct impacts of fire, so it's not just smoke and it's not just thermal burns, but it's also people being displaced from their usual points of care. What does it look like for someone who has chronic medical conditions, diabetes, heart failure, when they can't access their usual doctor and their EMR is not linked to the community that they've had to go to? What does that do to their long-term health outcomes? So the impacts of fire on the health of communities is actually a lot more profound than we might think it is. So the first point we're going to talk about is some research that we've conducted, which was looking at the risk to hospital facilities in Australia from fire. And we did that with geospatial analysis. So we used hospital data to look at public hospitals where people stay for more than 24 hours, and then looked at bushfire zones across Australia, and then geospatially mapped the distance from the hospital to the bushfire zone to give us an idea of the risk. One of the really tricky things in Australia is all of the states define bushfire risk differently, which makes it very difficult to compare like with like. So we have at risk, not at risk, and then we have whole tiers of systems. So how do we say in Victoria if you're at risk? What does that mean in South Australia? Oh, didn't like that, did it? So what we ended up doing was just saying if you are within 500 metres of any of these zones, you are at risk as a binary measure to make it a little easier. And what we found was about 59% of hospitals in Australia are at risk from bushfire. So pretty significant and much, much more pronounced in regional and rural areas, which they're often the only hospital for hundreds and hundreds of kilometres around. So that's a pretty big impact. And this is what it looked like when we looked at how we visualised that. So red dots are at risk, black dots are not at risk. This is the state that I live in. And you can see outside of the city, nearly everything is at risk. That kind of black dot that's by itself is about 523 metres out of a fire risk zone. So it's almost there, and then that would be a red dot as well. So as we've talked about, many profound and varied impacts. So this is what I want to get to, is how do we visualise this? Is it good to just put those things up in an academic way? Does that get the message across? Are there other ways we can do this? So graphic medicine is something that's been around for a while, and that's using drawing, graphic novels, comic books to convey concepts within medicine. So not just explaining to patients, but also how do we talk about things within ourselves, and how do we communicate academic concepts and research? Can we do that using a visual style rather than just using words or putting up slides? So We know that people learn better if they discover things for themselves, if they can construct their learning from looking at a picture rather than just reading a whole bunch of words. So what we're in the process of doing is conceptualizing this research in a graphic novel type way. So this is still a work in progress, but this is what it's going to look like. So you still have a few words, but then we've got pictures around that and different ways that people can look at this and really reflect, maybe think more intensely and emotionally about what this is actually like, rather than just having the words on a page. So we can still use some of the things that we've used. We can still use, for example, the maps and bits and pieces. There's many different ways you can convey these concepts in a graphic novel. You can use a kind of multimodal approach to do it. This is another way. So just putting words on a page. I want you to think about, this is some stories from some colleagues of mine who have lived experience of working in bushfires in Australia. These are the stories that they told to me when I talked to them and said, what was it like? Do we think putting words up on a page like this, or if I was speaking the words or if I was talking to them, is that more emotive? Does it get the point across more than it would be if we drew this? Or if we drew this in a comic style that didn't have any words? What is a better way to convey this? Both can be true as well. So it's still quite impactful, I think, to see some of these words, to understand what it would be like. But pictures have a way of really making us feel that viscerally as well. So it's certainly another way we can do it. And once again, this is just some dot points about what they did, which I think, if we look at it presented in this way, it seems more like you're in a lecture, doesn't it? It's not really telling the story in the same way. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite Dr. Tess Wiskell, who is my colleague, to come up, and we're going to have a bit of a conversation about Tess's experience of wildfires in her work and with her family. And what I want you to think about whilst we're doing this is, of course, this is another way to tell the story, isn't it? So having a conversation and hearing from Tess and her lived experience, is that another really profound way to convey this? Well, thank you for joining me, Tess. So please, I want you to just talk a little bit about your work maybe and about your family's experiences with fires if you can.
Thank you very much for having me, Dr. Humphrey. So I, like Kimberly, I'm from a zone with lots of wildfires. So I grew up in Western Canada and California, and I'm also seeing them increase in severity and frequency over the course of my lifetime. And that's actually what got me into this work. And my friends and family have been impacted by them, and not just by the smoke, but by actually being evacuated and having their homes and communities lost. And that's what really made me want to think about how we look at the personal aspect of this. And I think the telling of stories is really important there. I think some of the things I see from that is that this is not just what's in the media for a couple days or a week or two, but this impacts communities over months and years. And it's motivated some of the work I'm doing right now, which is in a rural community in California, and looking at medically vulnerable community members. So those that use medical devices, those with chronic medical conditions, those that have extra needs, extra mobility needs. And I've spoken with them and seen what their thoughts are as far as preparedness and response to wildfires and what they need for this evacuation. And I think this is really interesting as a way right now we're working on how to get that information back to the community. And I think it's really interesting to think about how to do that.
Absolutely. So I think we know that health, when we're not even talking about it within ourselves and how we protect our patients, health is such a powerful lever across sectors to make people sit up and realise that we need to take action, that we need to decarbonise, that we need to phase out fossil fuels, is a really impactful way of getting these stories like Tess is telling us across to people using different modes of communication like comics, like graphic novels. We know that there are graphic novels that are out there about the Holocaust. We can convey very serious, very intense experiences in ways that aren't just the written word or aren't just people standing up and talking about it. And I think we really have to think about, what does that look like? Is that something that we can build into our communication styles? And I speak as somebody who, that's not my natural place where I go to tell a story, but it is something that you can learn too. It is, you find your own style, and it's just, I think it's a different tool that we can use to get our point across, and really important. So this is just an example of that. So this is a comic that was created to prepare interns and junior doctors for the realities of being a doctor, that went into an orientation guide. So it wasn't about the medical stuff about being a new doctor, but it was like, how do you capture the other stuff? How do you say to somebody who is about to take their first step onto the ward as a proper doctor,
What is burnout like? What's referring a patient like? What is it like when your patient dies? It's hard to put that into words. It's hard to kind of dot point that. So presenting at something like this kind of shows you other people's lived experience. It makes you reflect on the fact that you're not alone, I think, in a way that is difficult to do just with the written word. And we can do that similarly here. So we know that lived experience is powerful. It's really powerful to hear the stories of people who've been impacted in communities. It's really powerful to hear the stories of health practitioners who, whilst their community is impacted and they're living through all of that, have to treat patients, look after the people in the hospital, think about the infrastructure and all of those things. What is the best way we can get that across? How do we tell our stories of research? How do we tell our stories of impacts on people and places and communities? And I want you to just think about what the best way is that we can get that message across to each other, but also to the broader community. And that is it. Thank you.